Looking to up your audio game? Well, recently, longtime channel partner SteelSeries released their first ever set of earbuds specifically designed for both gaming and everyday use. Their Arctis Game Buds support 2.4 GHz wireless, Bluetooth, active noise cancelling, and up to 40 hours of use before having to plug them in. I've been using them since they released and they're fantastic, and you can get a 12% discount on them when you use offer code SKILLUP at checkout. Stick around to the end of the video to learn more. Okay, so firstly, you have to understand how weird this preview event was. Typically when you get invited to a studio event, it's one day in the studio, which is like a PowerPoint deck in the morning, a few hours of gameplay during the day, and a Q&A at the end of the day to wrap things up. A single day in the studio and you're done. Sometimes that might stretch out to 2 full days in the studio, like recently when I was at Bungie HQ playtesting Marathon, but even that is highly unusual. When Kojima Productions invited me to the studio to playtest Death Stranding, it wasn't for 1 day, it wasn't for 2 days, it wasn't for 3 days. It was for 4 full days playing Death Stranding 2 with basically nothing on the agenda. It was intended that we would play a full 30 hours of this game just for the preview. That is the level of confidence that they have in this video game. And let me tell you, that confidence is more than justified, but we'll get to that. Firstly though, some admin. Yes, I was invited by Sony and Kojima Productions. They did offer to cover my costs for travel and accommodation, but as per usual, I declined covering my own costs so that you can be guaranteed truly independent coverage. I did spend the full 4 days in the studio. I did participate in a group Q&A session with the game's senior leadership team, and I was present for a 1-hour group Q&A session with Kojima-san, where he gave some fascinating insight into his thinking as it relates to video games, music, film, world events, and of course, Death Stranding 2. With regards to spoilers, I'm super sensitive to that sort of stuff with a game like this, so for that reason, I won't be covering any story stuff, or at least like nothing major, you know, like story setup stuff, absolutely. You know, like I'll talk about the fact that a character has a cool backstory, but I won't tell you what that backstory is, obviously. I, of course, won't be revealing any major plot events, but I will be talking about some stuff which people might consider a spoiler, like where is the game set, for example. So if you're okay with that sort of stuff, then great. Otherwise, I recommend not watching any coverage or even any trailers, to be honest with you, because Kojima trailers often have a habit of giving away a little too much. Finally, I did put out a call for questions about Death Stranding 2, and a bunch of you responded, so thank you for that. I'm going to be answering as many of those as I can throughout this video, like this question from Phoenix Splicer, who asks, did he scan your feet? To which I say, a gentleman never scans and tells. So with that out of the way, what do I think about Death Stranding 2 on the beach? Well, I think that to understand my thoughts on this, you really need to understand my thoughts on the first game, which is to say that right out the gate, I thought Death Stranding was an absolute masterpiece. So weird, so innovative, so beautiful, so singular. It offered up an entirely new gameplay model we'd never seen before, and through its asynchronous social strand elements, it offered a perfect union of gameplay mechanics and narrative themes. As Sam toiled to connect the US continent to the chiral network, you toiled for hours to build roads and zip lines and other structures that you'd likely only use a handful of times, and you did that because you knew that you were helping others. In your moments of need, you might suddenly chance upon a charging station or a mailbox that contained vital supplies, and the only reason they'd be there is because someone else left them there for you. It was a game about connections to those you knew and those you didn't, and that marriage of mechanics and message made it, in my view, perfect. But obviously, Death Stranding met a pretty mixed reception at launch. IGN scored it 6.8 out of 10, Giant Bomb scored it 2.5, one outlet scored it 3.5 out of 10, writing, quote, Death Stranding is an irredeemable piece of garbage that should serve as a warning to publishers who give developers carte blanche to create art. End quote. I think it's fair to say that there's been a fair amount of revision when it comes to Death Stranding and its reception post-launch. Many people went into it expecting something like Metal Gear Solid 6, and what they got was this weird-ass walking simulator. It was discombobulating, and so initial reactions were confused and sometimes hostile. But with the passage of time, people began to engage Death Stranding on its own terms, divorced from those pre-release expectations, and what they found was a game that was extraordinary. But owing to the strange and disorienting nature of Death Stranding, it did take a while for people to get there. And with that set up, I can finally get to my take on Death Stranding 2, and it's this. I think the core of Death Stranding was always perfect, and I think Death Stranding 2 just helps you realize that faster. Death Stranding 2 offers better story pacing, better visuals, better combat, better stealth, more flexibility in the sandbox, more diversity in mission design, and more ways to customize your experience. For that reason, Death Stranding 2 impressed everyone that I spoke to at that preview event. Every single person loved it, and many of them cited those changes or expansions or improvements when talking about why they loved it so much. But for me personally, I feel like many of the changes that Death Stranding 2 delivers are actually kind of surface level. I'd almost characterize them as tinkering around the edges. There's more combat, but I think it's kind of the same as before in that it's not very deep or challenging. There's more stealth, but it's similarly simple. The new weather system and day-night cycle can make your journeys from point A to point B more challenging or more beautiful. But ultimately, this is still a game about going from point A to point B, picking up discarded packages as you do that so you could, get additional likes when you hand them in. It's still a game about carrying as much on your back as you can, holding the left and right triggers as Sam tilts side to side. It's still a game where you crest a hill to see an expanse open out before you, some licensed track from a trendy folk singer kicks in, and you begin your descent. I suspect that many of the previews you see for Death Stranding 2 will tell you that it's really good because it adds a lot to the Death Stranding formula, but I think that Death Stranding 2 is really good because it trusts in the inherent brilliance of the core Death Stranding formula. The good news is that there's no tension between these two perspectives. Those of you who love the first game will love this one just as much, and those of you who didn't are going to find so many new pathways into this experience. Ultimately, we all end up at the same point, the point at which we put down the controller, shake our heads and whisper to ourselves, God damn it, man. He's done it again. YouTube user Sleazy asks, while playing Death Stranding 2 for the first time, what caught your attention immediately? Well, let me tell you, the opening of Death Stranding 2 is one of the most stunning, most arresting, most jaw-dropping openings I've ever experienced in a video game, for real. It's a moment that's going to make someone who's never played Death Stranding before go, what the fuck is this? And it's a moment that's going to make returning fans go, oh yeah, baby, we are so back. After that, what you'll certainly notice when playing Death Stranding 2 is the uplift in visual fidelity, but I don't want to oversell it. There's definitely a sharper image here, there's more detail in the terrain, the HDR implementation is really fantastic, particularly given there's now a day-night cycle, and the sunsets just go super hard in this game. There's also a boss fight about 20 hours into the game that's quite possibly the single best looking sequence I've ever experienced on a console. For real, it's I don't even have words to describe how good it looks. Unbelievable. But a lot of what I'm describing here is about Kojima Productions taking art design to the next level, or being more comfortable with the Decima engine and being able to push it further. Death Stranding 1 was a PS4 title, and Death Stranding 2 is exclusive to the PS5. You'd think that that generational leap might have resulted in a bigger visual delta, but both Kojima himself and his technical lead said to us during separate Q&A sessions that the leap between the PS4 and the PS5 wasn't that vast. The technical director said that the consoles were kind of similar, and the biggest uplift they were able to achieve was in removing loading screens. Kojima said something similar when asked about the move to PS5, saying that because the technological gap between the two consoles was so narrow, they had to focus more on other innovations, such as gameplay and storytelling. So for that reason, Death Stranding 2 definitely looks better than Death Stranding 1, but it's less about technical uplift, and it's more about visual diversity, art direction, and terrain detail. Really interesting to note though, that there are two graphical options available, quality and performance. Quality seems to be running at a solid 30 FPS and has more detail in the image, particularly with respect to terrain and vegetation. I played on performance mode, which was a really solid 60 FPS frame rate, or if it wasn't 60 FPS, it was certainly doing a good job of looking like 60 FPS, and we were playing on base PS5s, not PS5 Pros, like base PS5s, and it looked and ran fantastic. I do imagine that the PS5 Pro mode is going to kind of be the visual fidelity of, quality mode combined with the performance of performance. 60 FPS looking great, but I'll tell you what, man, you're not going to feel shortchanged if you play this on a base PS5. I was playing on a base PS5, and I was regularly blown away by how good this game looks and how well it runs. It's pretty marvelous. So what else do you notice when you step into Death Stranding 2? Well, the pacing is worlds different versus Death Stranding 1. I actually just replayed Death Stranding 1's opening, and it's a solid 2 hours of mostly cutscenes before the game properly opens up. That is absolutely not a thing here in Death Stranding 2. From the minute the opening sequence rolls, you are in control of the action. There are, of course, cutscenes at regular intervals after that, but the focus is on keeping the experience playable. Personally, I was never bothered by the slow start of Death Stranding 1, but if you were someone that was, then I think you're going to find Death Stranding 2 a much more welcoming experience. So let's talk briefly about the story, but like I said, no spoilers here, going to keep it extremely high level. You may be wondering, do I have to have played Death Stranding 1 before playing Death Stranding 2? Opinions on this are going to vary greatly, but in my personal view, absolutely, you should play Death Stranding 1 first. There is a story so far vignette thing that you can load up from the main menu to catch you up on the events of Death Stranding 1, but the truth is that's unhelpful because that recap is focused on the plot of Death Stranding 1, and I would argue that the plot is kind of silly. The real brilliance of Death Stranding storytelling was its world building and its characters and this ethereal, otherworldly vibe that everything gave off. A story recap can't possibly communicate any of that. One of the downsides of Death Stranding 2 jumping straight in and getting things going really quickly is that it doesn't take time to reintroduce you to the world and the characters. It really does assume a huge amount of knowledge on the player's part, and while you could get by without that knowledge, I think you're missing out on a hell of a lot if you haven't played that first game. Because don't forget, this is actually like a direct chronological sequel in a way that Kojima is kind of like never made before. Like Metal Gear games jumped around a lot in terms of timeline and settings and locations and characters. Death Stranding 2 though is set straight after the events of the first game and most of the cast are returning. It's a much more contiguous work from Kojima than we're used to, so all the more reason why that backstory matters. Anyway, so what's the story set up for Death Stranding 2? Well, it's basically do it again, but in Mexico this time. At least that's how it starts. Sam has successfully connected the US by way of the chiral network, and now he's asked to connect Mexico in the same way. He's reluctant at first, but certain events force him to agree, and so off he goes to Mexico. Not long after that, something very strange happens. Reports begin to emerge of Australian flora and fauna appearing in Mexico. At this point, I'm like, Australia mentioned! This wasn't a huge surprise since one of the characters in the game is the very literally named Tar Man, and his appearance is modeled on that of the actual Australian director George Miller, responsible for the iconic cinematic masterpiece set in Australia, Babe, Pig in the City. But also some other movies as well, I think, I'm not sure. Regardless, I just thought these Australian mentions were like little nods to George, like, you know, Kojima throwing his boy some love. But very soon after that, it was revealed that we were actually going to Australia in Death Stranding 2. And I won't spoil how you get there, but you do. You go to Australia. And in fact, I can tell you that the majority of Death Stranding 2 is set in Australia. What makes this especially funny is that like on like day one or whatever, I was sitting at a table with a whole bunch of like British journalists, and one of them was like, "Oi, wouldn't it be funny if Death Stranding 3 was in Australia like?" It's my British accent, by the way. And I'm like, yeah, that actually would be pretty funny because, you know, it actually would make a lot of sense if you think about it. There's a lot of empty space in the middle of Australia. Sure, let's put a Death Stranding game there, right? Literally like 2 hours later, we are walking the Australian continent, connecting Australia to the chiral network. So as one of the 2 Australians that attended this event, I feel like I am very uniquely positioned to speak on this topic. So I hope you'll indulge me as I hold forth for a little bit. Does Kojima's Australia look like the real Australia? Well, I ask you, does the United States look like the volcanic wastes of Iceland? No, it doesn't, okay? Realism is not the point. In speaking on the subject during a Q&A, art director Yoji Shinkawa said that they were looking to deliver a primordial rendition of Australia, one that fuses the modern Australian landscape with the elements underpinning Death Stranding's post-apocalyptic visual style. Realism is not the goal, and nor is accuracy. And this is true. At one point during the group Q&A interview, the lead level designer looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry I put a frost-capped mountain in the middle of your country." And that's true, by the way, because there actually is, in the middle of the map of Australia in Death Stranding 2, a giant frost-capped mountain there. And that's basically the exact opposite of what's actually in the middle of Australia, because there's nothing but just hot desert out there, you know? Australian accents are fraught things in the world of video games. Most of the time, everyone sounds like Junkrat. Thankfully, the majority of the Australian preppers that you meet during your time on the Australian continent actually have Australian accents because they are actually played by Australian voice actors. So I thought that was a really nice touch. But more than that, I could tell that the dialogue that they were saying was written by an Australian because it had very, very specific words that only Australians use. Like we have this phrase, which is like Buckley's chance. You know, you would say, "Oh mate, he's got Buckley's chance of that happening." You know, it's not gonna happen. So that's a phrase that like our fucking parents use. Like we don't even use that today in Australia. It's so old and so Australian, okay? So when I heard one of the NPCs say this line, I'm like, an Australian wrote this. I have to find out who wrote this. So later on, we were in a group Q&A session, and one of the people translating was this Australian bloke. And so I went up to him afterwards and I'm like, g'day mate. And he's like, g'day mate, you know, and then we started chatting, and turns out he's the lead localizer for the game. And so Kojima would write the script in Japanese, and then this guy would translate it into English, and more specifically like Australian English, you know? And he was there during all the voice recordings and whatever else. And it's just really fascinating because he was not hired because he was Australian. He was just hired as the lead localizer and happened to be Australian. So it does result in a level of authenticity that I think is rare when it comes to, you know, the way Australians are portrayed in video games. And I really liked it, so hats off, good job. Beyond that though, how does the Australian location differ from the American setting? Well, I'd characterize the differences as subtle but welcome. For example, there's a new gameplay mechanic that allows you to capture live Australian animals like kangaroos and quokkas, and you can then take them back to an animal sanctuary to be cared for. You can also kill those creatures, but please don't do that because quokkas are adorable, and if you hurt them, you're a bad person. What else? Oh, there's a new weapon in Death Stranding 2. Forget piss grenades. Sadly, it seems like they're not making a return. Say hello to the blood boomerang, which I don't have any footage for, sadly, but it's exactly what you think it is. It is a boomerang that Sam fills with his own blood, and then he throws it at BTs to damage them, and of course it will come back to him. It's like the most Kojima thing I could possibly imagine. You do see more biome diversity in Australia than you do in Death Stranding 1's United States. There's the same expansive tundra and mountainous regions, but there's a lot more vegetation as well. Some of the areas are almost jungle-like in appearance, and given how good the Decima engine is at rendering vegetation, this was a very natural fit for DS2. I think the weather you'll experience in the Australian landscape is perhaps its defining characteristic. Death Stranding 2 has an all-new weather system that can dynamically spin up sandstorms, flash floods, and most notably, bushfires. There was a mission where I had to rescue a kangaroo who was trapped in the middle of a bushfire, and to make my way through the flames, I was given a tar turret, which basically pumps tar up from beneath the earth, and then you can spray it to extinguish the fire. You can also walk around while spraying this thing, so it kind of feels like Splatoon or Mario Sunshine, but in Death Stranding, it's very fun, very cool. And I guess that's a neat transition to talk about the sort of gameplay enhancements and expansions that Death Stranding 2 serves up. Boat378 asks, what are the major innovations going into the sequel? Is there much that's majorly different from its predecessor, or is it still an exploration/delivery game at its core? Great question. So there are 3 gameplay buckets in Death Stranding. There's traversal, there's combat, and there's stealth. Let's talk about the traversal first. This is the part of the game where you're going to see the least amount of innovation and iteration. The core systems of carry weight and balance and terrain difficulty and scanning and upgrades that make it easier to carry stuff, that's all identical, and I think it's just as fantastic here as it's always been, but it is pretty unchanged except in one key area. Gregory asks, did they make the difficulty harder in terms of on-foot traversal? It was very easy to abuse vehicles in Death Stranding 1, and on-foot traversal became non-relevant very, very quickly. So I think you might be disappointed to hear that they made the on-foot traversal even easier than it was in the first game. In 30 hours of play, I definitely noticed fewer challenging on-foot missions, and I did feel as though the overall calibration of things like carry weight, balance, and terrain just felt more forgiving. I think a few other people noticed something similar, and they liked it because they felt like Death Stranding 1 was a little too arduous and frustrating at times. Personally, I didn't feel that way. I loved that challenge. I do think it's easier here, but I don't think it's been sanded back too much. I think it still feels good. As for vehicles, they're pretty much the same as before, only now you can mount turrets onto your vehicles and do sick-ass drive-by shootings. Nuch asks, what are the new structures the player can build? Was there any new components to the asynchronous gameplay? Again, doesn't seem to be too much here. The one exception is a monorail network that you can now build. So roads still exist as before, but in addition to that, you can now build a vast monorail network that connects mining facilities. These mines allow you to extract a huge amount of resources in one go, so much so that you couldn't even transport them by truck. So the monorail lets you move vast amounts of resources from one end of the map to the other, which is crucial if you're looking to build roads or other major structures out in frontier country. So let's talk about combat and stealth next. And this is where I think my opinion of Death Stranding 2 will diverge the most from popular opinion. See, Death Stranding 2 has a lot more missions that send you face to face with human enemy combatants. I'd say about quarter of the missions were ones that directly sent you into an enemy encampment to either steal something or sabotage something or rescue someone or just incapacitate them all. When you're on a mission like this, you have two options: full frontal combat where you just shoot everything, or stealth where you sneak around trying to silently take down your foes. Both combat and stealth have substantially more tools to support that playstyle. There are more guns, more melee weapons, more grenades, more takedown tools, more distraction tools, the list goes on. In many ways, the arsenal that you can bring with you into combat or stealth-focused missions does start to feel like the sort of arsenal that Snake might have brought with him as he headed into a mission in Metal Gear Solid 5. But I really do think that's where the comparison ends, because level design and enemy AI and health economies and, vision cones and patrol paths, none of it feels like it's calibrated to ask very much of you. On that point, Gregory asked, did they improve the combat, aka make it more challenging? And the simple answer to this is absolutely not. I think it's the same as the first game, which is to say that, in 30 hours of play with Death Stranding 2, I didn't die once. And I never once encountered a situation where I was fighting against human enemies where it really felt like a properly tense kind of butt-clenching scenario, you know what I mean? Unquestionably, the sandbox has been substantially broadened. You have so many more options available to you now. It still feels like you're shooting at target dummies, and the same could be said of the bosses. I fought 3 of them here. They looked just as extraordinary as they did in the first game. They are brilliant, unmatched spectacle, just utterly jaw-dropping, but they're still just shooting a thing until it dies. One of them is about shooting weak spots. Another one is shooting a target that can teleport, and that's really about it. You may be hearing all this and thinking, that sounds suspiciously like criticism, but I come back to what I said in my review of Death Stranding all those years ago. Combat is not the point of Death Stranding, and a sophisticated combat sandbox is not the goal. Combat is another weight that is put upon you. It's meant to weigh you down, not impede you. Failure conditions don't interest Kojima. He wants you to keep moving forward, but he wants you to have more choice in how you advance. In the group Q&A session, he said this almost explicitly when asked about his decision to include more combat in the game. Quote, "Well, I'm not recommending people to fight more or anything like that, but there are so many people all over the world asking me to make another Metal Gear, so I added more options for combat. But this is a game focused mainly on deliveries. You can avoid the enemy by taking the long way around, you could drive by quickly using a vehicle or bike, or you could fight the enemies. I wanted to leave that choice to the players," end quote. And that's the crucial point to keep in mind about Death Stranding 2. You do have more options, but as Kojima says, this is a game about deliveries, just as the first one was. It's the same. And so while I thought it was novel and interesting to see so much more combat and stealth on the table, I felt as though it didn't really enhance the experience for me, because I'm here to build roads and climb mountains and deliver packages, and Death Stranding 2 let me do that in my own country. What could be better? To wrap things up, let's answer a few questions we haven't got to yet. Sleazy is back and he asks, Death Stranding 1 was a huge game, and I wonder if the sequel would be gigantic or similar lengthwise. Well, the first game was about 40 to 50 hours long. I played in the studio for roughly 30 hours, and Kojima said that that would have equated to roughly 30% of the full experience. Now, I would be stunned if Death Stranding 2 is like a, 100-hour game in terms of its like campaign storyline playthrough. He's probably talking about like the full, completionist experience, 100 hours. Either way though, I'm pretty confident that this is going to be notably larger than Death Stranding 1. Because like I said, I played for 30-ish hours and, didn't feel like I was getting anywhere near the end. Like it almost felt like I was kind of maybe just getting into the start of Act 2 kind of thing, and kind of had that energy. So yeah, definitely expect a bigger game than the first one. Nooch asks, does nighttime affect gameplay in any way? The answer is yes, absolutely. Certain enemies only appear at nighttime. You also have a flashlight, which you can toggle on and off. Same with the headlights on your vehicles. And, operating at night just makes you generally harder to spot. So if you do have any stealth focused missions, it might be good to do those at nighttime. and you can sleep in your room to advance the time of day. Sabret420 asks, will I be able to customize the color of my suit and vehicles like in the director's cut? Or I guess how deep will customization be in general, like maybe even customize our rooms and such? You can customize your suit. There are different color options that unlock as you play. You can customize the color of your vehicles. Most importantly, you can customize your backpack by installing a bunch of add-ons that each take up a certain amount of slots on the backpack. Like imagine the inventory system of Resident Evil games where you kind of have a set number of slots and you need to rotate pieces to fit them. That's essentially what the backpack is, where you build these upgrades and they take up a certain amount of space, and they provide things like, you know, quieter footsteps or, you know, a solar battery so you can recharge your kit during the day, or more ammo capacity, etc. There's also a skill tree that Sam can put points into that offers different upgrades entirely, and you can redistribute those points at the start of every mission. So if you're headed into a combat-focused mission, you may want to put all the points into combat-y stuff, and if the very next mission is about schlepping across the map, then you may want to put all your points into traversal-focused skills. Gregory asks, will you be able to listen to music during gameplay? Yes, absolutely. Finally, Sam has discovered the iPod, or I don't know, the Walkman, given that it's a Sony game. But yes, you will have a music player that you can boot up anytime while you're out and about, listen to whatever song that you've already unlocked, and songs get unlocked as you progress through the story. You can also play songs in your room and listen to them. And I won't spoil something, but there may or may not be a musical number somewhere if you play the right song at the right time. Or not there. Marcello asks, for Death Stranding 2, is Kojima reflecting on any recent worldly event? I think he's always reflecting on world events, but during the group Q&A session that he did, he spoke at length about the stick and the rope. The rope is a kind of, you know, binding, unifying force that pulls us together, and the stick is, of course, the stick. It's used to push people away. It's violence. It's a metaphor for violence, right? And, you know, Death Stranding 1 was very much a game about the importance of the rope. And in this Q&A session that Kojima did, he explicitly states that Death Stranding 2 is a game about why the stick is also necessary. When speaking around this topic, he at one point said this, quote, "There are so many problems in the world today. Trump, Russia, wars going on throughout the world. Rope is not the solution to everything," end quote. So clearly Kojima is reflecting on those sorts of world events as he builds his stories. We've always known that. And in particular, on the face of it at least, this seems to be a less optimistic game than Death Stranding, but I don't know, obviously we need to experience the whole thing for ourselves. James Martinez asks, what is Mr. Kojima's favorite part about making video games since he's been doing so for almost 30 years? Obviously, I can't answer this question on Kojima's behalf because he didn't actually speak to this topic directly while we were there, but I can hazard a guess, and I can tell you that this guy really lights up when he starts talking about, you know, working with other creatives. And we know this, right? He loves working with actors and musicians and movie directors, etc. He had a Spotify original podcast that was just him interviewing cool people that he liked, and that's what led him to meet with and eventually collaborate with Jordan Peele. Kojima is a bit of a rarity in the video games industry since he's more interested in other art forms than he is video games, and while that's often leveled as a criticism against him and his work, I think it's what gives his work so much unique voice. Final question from Sleazy, because why not? He asks, is Kojima going to redefine the genre or gaming industry in some way with Death Stranding 2? Well, I firmly believe he did that with Death Stranding 1. I think he built a remarkable AAA game in less than 4 years while also building a brand new independently funded studio. I think he delivered a gameplay model we'd never seen before. I think the presentation was on the absolute cutting edge of the cutting edge. I think he confounded expectations and proved that he is far, far more than a one-trick pony. In Death Stranding 2, Kojima can't possibly meet that same, you know, that same accomplishment. I mean, you know, the studio is built and the gameplay model exists. The tech tools are established. The visual language and world design of the Death Stranding universe has been laid down, you know, it's all kind of there already. If Death Stranding 1 was a half-finished proof of concept full of unrealized potential that Death Stranding 2 could then realize, then perhaps Death Stranding 2 would have that kind of seismic ripple effect. And that kind of brings me back to where I started at the very beginning of this video, which is that I think a lot of people felt like Death Stranding was missing a whole bunch of stuff, and it did have a lot of unrealized potential. And I know that because I've seen plenty of online discourse to say that, and also because, you know, I was at this preview event and a lot of people playing Death Stranding 2 felt that way about Death Stranding 1. And every one of those people I spoke to was really blown away by Death Stranding 2. Like, they really, really loved it by the end. They felt like Death Stranding 2 was what they had hoped Death Stranding 1 would have always been. But like I said, for me personally, Death Stranding 1 was already everything that I had hoped Death Stranding 1 would be. And, you know, and it's still that here again in Death Stranding 2. It's just that through some very targeted interventions and enhancements, Kojima has found a way to push through or sidestep all of that initial resistance that stopped people from connecting with Death Stranding. I don't think his vision for Death Stranding has changed one iota, but I think the way he's invited people into that vision has evolved such that, you know, there are now fewer barriers and there are more on-ramps. And all the roads lead to the same conclusion. Death Stranding 2 is unique and special, and I love it. And after spending 30 hours with Death Stranding 2, I'm all but certain that I'll love the sequel as much as I love the original. Anyway, that's all I got. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Music and sound design is an integral part of the Death Stranding 2 experience, and if you want to hear every timefall raindrop and every note on this banging OST, then you probably want to check out SteelSeries' award-winning lineup of audio products. That lineup just got bigger recently because SteelSeries just released for the first time ever a set of earbuds that are meant to bridge the gap between gaming and everyday use, offering you the best of both worlds without any compromise. The Arctis Game Buds are a genuine revolution in the world of gaming and lifestyle audio because this is one product that can do it all. I mean, at a basic level, you get the excellent award-winning sound quality you've come to expect from SteelSeries. So whether you're listening to Gunfire and Call of Duty or your favorite tracks on Spotify, you're going to be getting clean, crisp highs and weighty, bassy lows. Then there's the tech that powers all of this. It supports Bluetooth, which is what you'd expect, but it also has a USB dongle that enables 2.4 GHz wireless. This is the industry standard for high-speed audio connections, way speedier and more reliable than Bluetooth, and it means the Arctis Game Buds can work with a PS5 since PS5s don't have native Bluetooth support. Since it supports both connection formats, you can actually have it connected to both 2.4 and Bluetooth at the same time, switching seamlessly between the two of them if you get a phone call, for example. And because it has that dongle, you can plug it into almost any device that has a USB-C port, including a PC, a Switch, a Steam Deck, and even a VR headset. The Arctis Game Buds also support 360-degree spatial audio, meaning they're compatible with games utilizing things like Tempest 3D audio, Microsoft Spatial, and Sonar Surround. Plus, there's a dedicated app that lets you select from over 100 custom gaming profiles, so you can be sure you're getting the best audio experience for the most popular games. It supports active noise cancelling, so you're only hearing the sounds you want to hear, and that battery life is crazy. 10 hours without having to dock them in the charger, and the charger will charge them 3 times for a total of 40 hours without having to plug them in. Best of all, for me at least, they stay in my ear. SteelSeries scanned over 62,000 ears to find a design that had the best chance of providing both fit and comfort, and they totally nailed it. SteelSeries sent me these early and I've been using them for months now. For real, I could not be more satisfied with them. I use them both at home and out and about. I use the 2.4 and the Bluetooth. I use them with and without custom sound profiles. No matter what I'm doing or how I choose to do it, they always impress me, and they've instantly become a staple in the way I play games and consume audio content. If you'd like to grab a pair, then I recommend getting in quick because it's a new product launch, and anytime SteelSeries drops anything new, it always sells out super quick. Visit SteelSeries.com and don't forget to use offer code SKILLUP at checkout because you'll get a 12% discount, no strings attached. That's SteelSeries.com, offer code SKILLUP at checkout for 12% off. Thanks SteelSeries for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.